Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn from the Transportation Equity Task Force. We now call ourselves TREC, EQ, Advocates Building Lasting Equality in New Hampshire, or ABLE New Hampshire as we know it, advocates for the civil and human rights of children and adults with disabilities. We promote full participation by improving systems, connecting families, inspiring communities, and influencing public policy. ABLE asks its stakeholders what topics are most important to them. And recently in 2024, folks told us that transportation was really something that we needed to address and focus on. So at that time, we formed the Transportation Equity Task Force and went to work trying to decide what that task force would bring to its audiences. We decided to do this Lunch and Learn series because we want to help people with disabilities become aware of all of the transportation options that are out there and to help them become comfortable with the tools to get to the places that they need to travel to. Next month, we're going to be talking about the Community Transportation Needs Assessment. In September, we're going to talk about advocating for better transportation systems. So those are the two that are coming up. In the past, we've done many Lunch and Learns. I think we're up to about 12. And you can find the one-pagers from all of those Lunch and Learns and also recordings from previous topics in the archive on the ABLE New Hampshire website. So if you get to ablenh.org, just look for the task forces and scroll to transportation equity. You'll find everything there. Today, we're going to be talking about community ride sharing. It's very underexplored. Generally, when we do a Lunch and Learn, we tell you how it's working in the state of New Hampshire, how to do it. However, today we're going to take a little bit of a different approach. We're going to talk about how community ride sharing could be working in the state of New Hampshire if we were paying more attention and putting a little bit more focus on it. Our featured speaker is Steve Workman, Director of Transport New Hampshire, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Steve.
Hi, everybody. So it's great to be back here with ABLE for one of these Lunch and Learns. I was last with you, I think, earlier this year in the winter. And now it's beautiful July. I really wish actually we were sitting at one of our beautiful state parks and we were having just a discussion lakeside about all of this. But hey, the technology gets us here. So as Lisa said, we're going to approach this a little bit differently. We're going to try to take inspiration from across the country with some programs that work. And I want to say up front, and I'll probably say it again throughout this, this is not an indication that New Hampshire is not doing something right. It also is not exhaustive. So some of the things I will talk about, there may be elements or parts of it happening someplace in New Hampshire already. What we're doing today is we're trying to inspire ourselves and most importantly, empower all of you to address your transportation needs and to move the system into something that is working for all of us, not just a select few. So with all things transportation, you've probably figured this out by now. There's a lot of jargon. We have specialized terms. It gets very complex because it starts all the way at the federal government, who provides the states with most of its funding to do major transportation system work. Then it goes through the states, and the states put their own version of jargon on and talk about things slightly differently. So we're always trying to bridge that gap. And if you've seen my other presentations, you know I won't shy away from those technical terms. But what I try to do is break it down so that you understand what those terms are. So with that, if you run across something and I don't explain it, please make a note of that so that when we get to questions, we can go back and cover that. So shared use mobility, that's really where community ride sharing actually goes under. Before we can make sense of where we might be able to create a specialized system that works for the disability community in New Hampshire, we have to understand the whole universe, because when you say things like ride sharing or peer-to-peer transportation or neighbor helping neighbor or any of those things, it can mean something different for every person. So we're going to break this down and try to figure out, well, what exactly is it? So let's start at that federal level. So here's the big picture. So the Federal Transit Administration defines shared use mobility as transportation services that are shared among users. Well, that's not really complicated, is it? No. But this is a list that it includes, and this isn't even an exhaustive list. But I can tell you most of these things actually exist in New Hampshire in some way, shape, or form. So some of the things that fall under shared use is public transit and shuttle services. Remember, our public buses, for those that are living in areas with a public bus system in New Hampshire, those are ride shares. Yes, there's a transit company that owns and operates the bus. There's a driver on there, but it's just you and your neighbors piling onto that bus going to wherever you need to go. Then, of course, taxis and limos. Well, a lot of you, I'm sure, have used taxis. Many of us maybe have only used a limo in special occasions or maybe an airport limousine service. But nevertheless, those are part of shared mobility. Then there's transportation network companies, or TNCs. Well, there's some jargon. What the heck are those? Uber and Lyft. There's your best example of what those are. And I will say a little more about that later because they're so prevalent in everybody's mind. I think it's important that we just take a little bit of time later in the presentation to talk about them. Then there's ride sharing. So this can take the form as carpooling and van pooling. So a lot of times we talk about this in terms of commuting, like commuting to your work and trying to figure out, does your employer provide something like this, like a van for the company? Or are you partnering with colleagues at the same company or in the same location and traveling through? Then there's car sharing, and this is a personal vehicle. So this can be very informal. So a very informal peer-to-peer example would be you have a car and your friend needs a ride and you give them a ride. That's car sharing. That's peer-to-peer. But it can also lead to a more sort of organized, systemic program, and that would be our volunteer driver programs. Now, I know that many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with those and have used some. I know many of you take advantage of Future in Sight and their volunteer driver program, and then there are countless others throughout the states. So those are definitely ride sharing. And depending how they're structured, they can take different forms. So it isn't always peer-to-peer or sort of we're just making it work. Sometimes it's actually a transit organization that has put together a volunteer driver program. Other times it may be something like a faith community who offers a program that's really for the members of their particular church. And then finally, bike and scooter sharing. And that's a real thing. And those of you that have traveled around to some of our bigger cities, you may notice that there are areas where you can see bicycles, scooters in some cases, less so out here in New Hampshire. And these on a network where you can actually rent those. And often there's an electronic sort of app that you can use to access them. They're freely used. You return them in a designated place and the system continues. So that's what we mean about bike and scooter type sharing programs. That's going to be the last I talk about this today because certainly bike and scooter sharing, that is for people that are physically able to do so. And so we want to look at the big picture, making sure we're creating systems first that all users can find a way to access. The shared mobility landscape. So breaking that down, so that list we just looked at, we can put in a couple of different big buckets, if you will. So the first one would be public transit. So that's the fixed route buses, it's the rail lines. It also includes paratransit. And so we think of these as the regional backbones in New Hampshire, but also throughout the country. So those are the things that they are there. And then we have to find solutions to get people to those services or in areas where we don't have any of these services, and we call those transportation deserts. Next is car sharing, like we talked about. So that's pooling community assets. So assets in this case would often be vehicles and drivers so that members share wheelchair accessible vehicles, for example. I also would include, because you're going to see that WAV or wheelchair accessible vehicles. You'll see this a couple of times in this presentation, but I want to put a note there that we do recognize that there are other adaptive or assistive technologies that people have put on cars that allows them to use a car and drive themselves. So it isn't always about just making sure that a vehicle is actually wheelchair accessible. And then finally, we look at the peer-to-peer ride sharing, and that's really what we want to focus on today. And this is direct peer travel networks. It's community members that drive other people to daily appointments and social gathering. So it is truly neighbor helping neighbor. So volunteer driver programs, as we talked about in the initial slide, you've got a highly localized, trusted network where neighbors are driving neighbors using personal cars. Well, why are these highly trusted? Well, because even if it's a private, so let's go back to that church example. A church has a program that they operate for members of their faith community. In that case, those drivers should be vetted. That means, are they safe? Is it okay to get into a car with them? Do they understand what it means to be a volunteer driver? What it means to provide a service to customers that are going to get into their personal vehicle? If you do not have a foundation of trust, these services will not work because fear is very real and there is good reason to be concerned about who am I getting into the car with? Because sometimes, especially the first time, this may be a stranger to you. Now, a good program is going to take steps to introduce you to their drivers, and they're going to make those connections, and they're going to make sure you know that this is a safe option for you. And at times they're coordinated by volunteers. So again, the church example. And then other times it could be within a transportation organization. So that could be some of our transit organizations, or it could be a standalone nonprofit. And we have examples of both in New Hampshire. And then there's cooperative car sharing. So this is direct peer travel network. So community members drive peers to daily appointments. So again, this is where you're using your vehicle to help another neighbor. So I told you I wanted to talk briefly about Uber and Lyft. So Uber and Lyft fall under this term that we called ride sourcing. It simply means you're setting up a ride, but here's the key. You actually use technology to do this. So what happens is you decide you need a ride, you go on to an online application, so you need internet access and you need a device like a smartphone. You go onto that platform and then you request a ride. And what the platform does is it matches your trip needs, your location, and your destination with an available driver. Now, some of these systems can allow you to book those in advance. Some of them you can do, for example, you get off the bus, you really weren't sure when that bus would arrive back in New Hampshire, but now you got to get from the bus station back to your home. So when you arrive, you put in and you say, I need a ride now. So Uber and Lyft are the biggest ones, and I know everybody on this call has heard about them at some point. They are great, but there's some things we have to understand about them. They are not the same as volunteer driver programs. These are companies that are working with individual drivers. Now, yes, they vet their drivers and they have policies that are supposed to govern those drivers. However, it does not have the same level of protections that you get when you're using one of our publicly funded transportation systems or publicly funded volunteer driver system, because those make sure and have a higher level of responsibility to make sure, for example, that we're dealing with ADA compliance issues, that we keep rides to a standard, or how about this, that the ride shows up. We have countless stories in New Hampshire and beyond of people that have booked these rides and have found out that either the driver never showed up or they made it to their destination, but no one ever came back to bring them home. This is unfortunate. So the other thing that Uber and Lyft doesn't do is guarantee that there are actually available drivers. It's essentially they've created this platform, they've put it out there and said, hey, you can use this, but it doesn't come with a guarantee that somebody up in Coos County is ready to take you from your home to wherever you need to go. So there's some risk involved in that, or rather no guarantee. Now, if you called one of our established volunteer driver programs, there's no guarantee that they can fill that ride for you, but they will tell you that. So you don't have to guess. They say, I'm sorry, we needed more advance notice, or I'm sorry, we don't have enough volunteer drivers on that date to be able to accommodate your ride. That's very different than somebody leaving you high and dry with no explanation. So, Uber and Lyft, are they important? Yes. Are they part of the solution for a big statewide transportation system? Yes, they very much are. Are there some individual risks that come with it? Yes, there are. So if you choose to use those, go into it with your eyes open. The other thing we know is cost. And you are going to be paying more market rates for this. And there aren't subsidies built into this. Now, you may be in a program where you can get money to pay for your Uber or Lyft ride, but Uber or Lyft is not extending that credit to you. So there's a lot of things you have to think about before you use those. Why does this matter to state leaders that are trying to look at these programs? Well, it would be very easy to say, there's your solution, and they could just wipe their hands of it. But knowing what I just said to you, then they can suddenly realize that they can't just simply say hands off, like find an Uber or a Lyft. And we've had conversations in the state about that, where people, let's say in human service transportation, so the Department of Health and Human Services in New Hampshire, we have professionals in that field who are not transportation experts, but they know they have to get people rides, especially to medical appointments. So a lot of times they hear about this and they think, well, this is going to work. This is going to solve our problem. And remember, they're partially right, but they need to be aware that this is not going to be a solution that works for everybody. So I think that's enough about Uber and Lyft for now to make people understand the difference and how that's not what our focus is going to be today. So instead of me talking, the jargon and the technical terms behind this, I decided let's look at some actual examples from across the country, because I'm a big fan of finding something that works someplace else and bringing it back home and adapting it so it works for, in this case, New Hampshire. We can also call this Don't Reinvent the Wheel. There are a lot of good programs that are out there. Truly, we can't always drop them into New Hampshire and they'll work automatically, but we can use them for inspiration or for policy decisions and understanding of how we might set up a similar system in New Hampshire for this. So we're going to look at two of these right now. So the first one is called V-Trip, and it's done by Comet and Able, South Carolina. So of course, the first thought was, wait a minute, my head went up. It said there's another Able in the country who has actually gone beyond talking about transportation and is partnered and is providing more direct transportation services. So this is really exciting. And when Lisa and I were talking about this, I looked at this example and I said, this feels like it was made for Able New Hampshire to think about really deeply. So what V-Trip does is it lets riders get money back to pay the people in their lives who drive them. So if you have a friend from church, work, school, or the neighborhood who gives you a ride, this program might help cover the gas expenses. Now, like every program, there's fine print. But the point is they used the established Comet public transit system. They created this partnership, and then they found ways to move that money around. What you will not get in my presentation is the deep details. I'm trying to whet your appetite or show you what's possible. But at the bottom of these case studies, I have that allows you to go and do some research on your own if you're interested in some of these things. If the link is something that's not accessible for you, then I suggest that you do a search prompt. So in this case, you could do V-Trip by Comet and Able, South Carolina. And most likely that will return a search and you can click directly onto their website. So let's talk about two key sides of this program. So self-recruited volunteers. So instead of dispatching strangers, V-Trip empowers riders with disabilities to select their own trusted drivers from friends or neighbors. How many of you have friends and neighbors who either have already helped you or would be willing to help out when the schedule's available? This would work. Whereas other volunteer driver programs, they provide volunteers that are part of their network. Now, there's nothing saying that your neighbor or your friend couldn't join that network and become a volunteer driver that way. But in this case, this is you literally, you are empowered to find the person that you want to travel with. And then there's some resources to help you reimburse that person who helped you for gas and regular wear and tear on their vehicle. So this preserves your autonomy. It's peer drivers. They already understand their specific accessibility needs. Well, isn't that nice? A friend of yours that actually already understands what your needs may be, instead of you going through the process of having to explain it every time there's a new driver, for example. Okay, but let's talk about the money part though. So the program uses grant funding to distribute monthly mileage reimbursements. So this particular program uses the federal mileage rate that the IRS establishes annually. And it provides it directly to the rider. So right now, their current rate in this program, you get 150 miles, and that comes out to $88 per month. So that's what you're given, and you can use those as needed up to that amount during that month. And then riders can pay the self-recruited driver directly. So removing that psychological barrier of feeling like a burden to somebody. And we heard that, right? Lisa mentioned you're going to be exploring our community transportation needs assessment next month. When we were talking to people, older adults, our disability community, veterans, and then other folks, young adults, people trying to get to work, we found that particularly with our vulnerable populations, so again, older adults, people with disabilities, they often expressed a concern that they were somehow a burden. We need to do away with that. We need to create programs that empower, and we need to find ways so that people can participate in these programs where they are able to maintain that dignity and they have a sense of, you're doing for me, but I'm able to do this back for you. This is the magic of peer-to-peer, because both of us get something in that relationship. So next example I wanted to explore. It's called ITN Ride Exchange Programs. Now this is a little complicated, so let me tell you about ITN America. So first, this is a national nonprofit. It shows up in a couple of ways, and I don't want to confuse the message today by talking about that. But they have done some really innovative programs. And what they do is they partner with folks. So like many of the transportation companies that are out there, they often can come in. So if you have money, you can partner with them, purchase their services, and create that and adapt that service for your needs in your particular area. So in that way, they're very similar. But they've also done a lot of incredible work creating really innovative programs. So I'm really talking about them under a broad banner, but I make this reference that they have these other proprietary programs they've created that all kind of work together to do what I'm going to share with you right now. So first, let me go back and actually read the description to those of you. So ITN America is a national nonprofit transportation system. The ITN model creates an efficient and financially sustainable solution to the transportation needs of their members. Personal transportation accounts, which is a registered trademark by ITN, and several of their proprietary programs empower riders and volunteers to meet community and their own transportation needs. So, two features that I want to call out about these programs and how they work in their system. So the first is a flexible cashless system. So rather than money going back between the organization, the people providing the ride, and you, which we know gets really tricky and complicated, if we're being honest, this doesn't function this way. So it manages that cash through technology and the movement of funds through its partner systems and agreements that are in place. So the members, they store their transportation assets as cash, prepayments, gift certificates, or non-cash credits. So what are we talking about here? We're not saying you've just got to reach into your pocket and pull out money. Yes, you can use your money and you can pre-purchase rides, and that will be credited to your account. But it's talking about using non-cash credits. Well, that's interesting. So let's unpack that. So, volunteer drivers, you get to use the same account. So, you have your own personal transportation account as a volunteer driver, and this tracks, it stores, and it manages the earned mileage credits that you have accrued by being a volunteer driver. This is incredible because it means while you're investing your time as a volunteer to help someone else who needs a ride, you're getting credit. You can put that credit in your bank and you can save it until a point in time when you're the one who needs help getting a ride. Or you could gift that to another person that needs a ride. So this is an incredible system. And when I was looking at this program, I thought to myself, we have some fantastic volunteer driver programs in this state. And I do know that there's a version of this that they talk about, but I really like the way this company has sort of laid that out and think about all the different ways. So let's jump over to the other column here, the earning credits for rides. So again, this is credits. This is not cash out of your pocket. So let's see what those ways are. So members can accumulate ride credits through multiple methods. So we just talked about being a volunteer driver. Great. Well, what about trading in an old vehicle? So this is really something for older adults because they were able to drive. They actually owned their own vehicle, but it got to a point where they were either physically unable or it was no longer safe or they did not want to drive on the roads these days. What to do about that vehicle? Well, this company has created a program where you can donate that vehicle and then you get a credit, and that credit goes into your bank account with this company so that you can use that for rides. And then finally, receiving birthday and referral bonuses. Well, that sounds pretty good. I don't mind a perk on my birthday. And I certainly don't mind referral bonuses because for these programs to work, we absolutely must have the volunteer drivers. We have this problem in New Hampshire. We can have the best volunteer driver program on paper, but if we do not have drivers, it doesn't do anybody any good. So the idea that you could refer drivers and that would get you an additional credit is fantastic. But we also need people to use the program. One of the biggest ways that transportation programs collapse is when people don't use them. We hear this in New Hampshire, and sometimes it's not true, but other times there's some truth to it. When people say, well, I see those buses, but it didn't look like there were many people in it. Well, sometimes that means the bus is out of service and it's returning to its bus depot. It's not supposed to have people in the vehicle at that time. But sometimes we do have a system, but the number of people using that system has not grown to where we need it to. Why do we need more people to use these systems? Because that's how we make it sustainable. So if you and I are using a system and we're paying into it, that's going to help. If two other people join us, that's more money coming in to sustain the system that now we all rely upon. So at this point, I'm hoping this has inspired you to say, I want to know more about this. How could we maybe take the principles or some of the ideas of their programs, and how could we begin to think about creating those programs in New Hampshire? Or how could we talk to existing programs and figure out maybe some innovative ways of doing these things? And then again, at the bottom of this slide, I've given you a website address that will take you to ITN's gateway where you can find out more about their different mobility programs. So what would this look like in New Hampshire? So building on what is working and innovating for what is not. I started the presentation by saying I did not want anybody to hear this presentation and think I was criticizing programs that we already have in New Hampshire. I'm not. However, I am somebody who believes that there's always room for improvement, or I like to think of it as continual growth. So we want to build on those success stories, those successful programs that are out there, successful networks like Able. We want to build on those. Those are the things that are working. Then we got to put on our thinking caps and we got to think big. We got to think outside the box. We've got to innovate. So when we're working in New Hampshire, and this slide now is referring back to the presentation we did for you back in February when we talked about our coordinating structures in New Hampshire. First off, what's it like to be in New Hampshire? Well, we're navigating rural and urban realities. And you don't have to go very far. You can be in downtown Manchester and you drive for about 15, 20 minutes and you can find yourself in a very rural feeling small town. So New Hampshire has a highly unique geographical split. We have the big cities and then we have rural counties like Coos and Grafton. And a lot of these areas is where we find those transportation deserts. Oh, and by the way, let's not forget that the universe dropped the White Mountains right in the middle of New Hampshire as well. That presents some very interesting geographic challenges because that makes trips longer and sometimes more difficult when you have to go around those pesky little mountains, as much as I love them. So that makes for quite a challenging situation for us to figure out how do we provide these services, especially for folks living in the North Country. Well, one of the best ways and one of the things that has been working is partnering with New Hampshire's regional coordination councils, the state coordinating council, and that allows us to design flexible and peer-led local solutions that scale statewide. Well, some of you have already heard and participated in your regional coordination council or the state coordinating council. But then there's another group of folks that work within both of these councils to help you. And that's our mobility management network. And remember, that's something I talked to you about back in February. The mobility managers in our state, they're the ones you talk to about trying to figure out what's possible within a region. And the advantage to that is if we figure out a program in a smaller area like a region, and that program is working, remember when I talked about transplanting? We can transplant that and expand it so it becomes part of a statewide system. So if it's working in the Manchester region, as an example, how can we adapt that and make it work over in Coos County? We have some specific barriers here. And again, this is no individual agency or individual's fault. It's kind of the reality that we live in New Hampshire. So first is that wave scarcity or the wheelchair accessible vehicles. So this is accessible or adaptive vehicles are extremely expensive to purchase. Those of you that have done that know what I'm talking about. If we move over to a community peer-to-peer solution, then we take advantage of grant-funded or cooperative assets to share or co-own shared vehicles. In other words, everybody doesn't have to own one of those vehicles because everybody can't afford to own one of those vehicles. But are there ways that we can share them? And I think there are. There's something called zip cars. They've been around for a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades now. Zip cars are most known for sort of taking your average car. So no adaptation, no wheelchair accessible. It's not they can't, it's just typically it's just regular cars. People participate in the program and these cars exist. They happen in big cities. And it's basically if you need a vehicle, you can go on the app, you can find a vehicle near you that's available and you can book that. And there's a fee associated with it and it uses technology and a platform. So when we talk about these peer-to-peer solutions, that's a model that exists that we would need to adapt, but at least it helps us understand it. Another problem we have is volunteer burnout. Now, this isn't just volunteer drivers, but I am going to focus on volunteer drivers. When drivers feel isolated and overworked, most volunteer drivers do so because they truly want to give back and help. Sometimes, when a volunteer driver understands how great the need is, they can feel like they always have to say yes. And this can drain them and drain them some more. But if we move over to more of this peer-to-peer solution, then we create these mutual aid support loops. We recognize people for volunteering. The program at ITN America where you can bank volunteering drive and you can give it away to somebody who's in need, or you can save it for when you need transportation. These are tools that actually prevent burnout. We prevent burnout. That means we get to keep our volunteer drivers who we so desperately need. Rural distance, I've already said about a bit on the last, so I won't belabor this, but those long miles result in heavy personal fuel expenses. And these days, if you've had to fill a car up at the pump, it hurts. Integrating mileage reimbursement through RCC networks and other innovative funding types. Why do I say through RCC networks? Well, the networks are one of the ways that we distribute our federal and state transportation dollars. Now, having said that, there is a process that you go through. You can't just come to the table with an idea and expect they'll turn around and write you a check, because we're constantly planning these things out through our state budget and our federal cycles. So we can be looking at 2 years in advance that we need to budget funding for. But what you can do is start talking about these needs at your RCC table. Then you can start thinking about how might we fund it. But there are other assets. There's charitable grant funds. There are these time banks, these credits we've talked about. There are industries that get involved. For example, merchants. In order for a merchant to be successful, people have to go to their store and buy things. So isn't it in their best interest to consider helping support these programs so that people can actually travel to their stores and buy the things they need? We need to do a better job talking about those things and selling them to businesses and service providers in our community, because they can be a source of funding and it is a mutual benefit. It is not them just donating dollars to us out of the goodness of their heart. They get something for it. And then finally, scheduling can be complicated. I don't want to suggest that peer-to-peer networking solves all of this. It does not, because you have to consider scheduling. But right now, often we have strict scheduling windows. So a lot of these volunteer driver programs we have in our state, and I am not criticizing them, there are reasons for this. They require anywhere from 3 to 2 weeks advance notice. That might be great when you're booking regular doctor's appointments way out, for example. But when you have an emerging need where you have to get somewhere and you didn't know about it until 2 days ago or maybe the day before, it would be nice to figure out how we could be more responsive to those needs throughout the state. So with peer-to-peer coordination and that local management, you can start figuring out, well, how might we actually put this into our existing systems and our platforms? So Keep New Hampshire Moving or other technology things. And when we do that, how does that improve the scheduling and the payment process for you, the user? And how might that change so that rather than us having to say, well, you have to give us 2 weeks notice before we can line up a volunteer, what if we were shifting to have enough of a volunteer pool so that we had drivers available on set days? And when their capacity was full, well, then their capacity is full. But that's different than just simply saying you have to wait to schedule. So it's an idea for how we might be able to improve. So whenever we talk about these volunteer driver programs or peer-to-peer or informal car sharing even, or you giving your neighbor a drive, people are always asking the question, what are we going to do for legal protection? Because let's face it, one lawsuit could take away everything we have. It's a serious issue, but here's the good news. The federal government and our states recognize these problems. In New Hampshire's case, there are 2 types of protection that can help you. So the first thing is an insurance protection. And on the slide, I have the reference for New Hampshire's revised statutes. They're called RSAs. So what are those? They're just the state laws. They had to give them a fancy name, so it's RSAs. So I've cited on this page which New Hampshire RSA or law is applicable here. So if you're wondering, you can go search, and I've provided the link to our government website, which lists all of our state RSAs, and you can find it and you can read in detail. but I want to summarize them. So let's start with insurance protection. So New Hampshire law strictly prohibits auto insurers from raising premiums, imposing surcharges, or canceling policies because a driver is a registered volunteer. The statutory protection removes massive financial barrier for community members willing to drive for their peers. So this is an existing law in New Hampshire that applies to all volunteer drivers in New Hampshire. But there's a second type of protection, and this is not just about transportation, actually. It can even deal with Good Samaritan laws, but this is limited liability. And so in New Hampshire, volunteers acting in good faith on behalf of a registered nonprofit or government entity are shielded from personal civil liability. So that shield is the protection. So the organization, the nonprofit or the government, yes, they're ultimately responsible. They're the ones that procure larger levels of insurance and put policies in place to deal with those issues. But you, as long as you're not doing something like getting drunk and deciding to get behind a wheel to give somebody a ride, that's negligence on your part. You will be held liable. But if you're just engaging in a volunteer driver through a formal program, this is going to protect you. So when we register our peer-to-peer networks with an established nonprofit, and that's the key, because we're moving from sort of an informal one, we're looking down the road to how we might put this underneath an existing organization, and we do that, these are the protections that we get back. I want to unpack, or go a little deeper actually with the insurance piece. We've already talked about those TCNs, so the Uber and Lyfts, and then volunteer drivers. There is a difference, and by explaining this, this may help you sort of wrap your head around where the line is. Primary insurance coverage. For a volunteer driver, the driver's personal auto insurance does cover the trip. Personal policy protection, yes. The insurance drops and surcharges are strictly banned, so they cannot increase your insurance premiums because you're a volunteer, just like we talked about on the last slide. Personal lawsuit shield, that immunity, so you're immune from it as a volunteer driver. You're legally protected from personal civil negligence suits. But what about those Uber and Lyft drivers? They have to think about this a little differently. So in their case, the corporate policy applies. So let's say Uber. When an Uber driver is driving around with no one in their vehicle, that's their personal insurance covering. But as soon as a rider gets into their car through Uber, then Uber's corporate insurance policy takes over coverage. Next up, there's no personal policies are excluded, commercial livery without expensive endorsements. So you cannot use your personal policy to make this coverage. They specifically write in insurance policy coverage that if you are working for someone like Uber and Lyft, you can't use that personal policy to protect you when you have a rider in your car. And then lastly, independent contractor status leaves personal assets fully exposed. So we talked about that personal immunity or that shield. When you're working for Uber and Lyft, you don't have that. It's not as robust. Now, will the company come and stand by you if something really happens? Well, that's for Uber and Lyft to decide, and I can't speak to their internal policies and how they respond to this, but it is definitely a concern. So by now you should see we found yet another difference between the Uber and Lyft solution versus our volunteer drivers or that peer-to-peer networking. So hopefully when you hear this, you can now educate other people and let them know that there are protections in place. Another thing that has to happen if this community decides it really wants to establish some of these programs, we must ensure a baseline of dignity and equity. What does that look like? Equivalent response times. Peer rides requiring wheelchair accessible vehicles must not experience disparately longer booking delays and an ambulatory riders. More technical speak. But basically it says, listen, if I need to use an accessible vehicle, I should be able to get that vehicle and get to my destination in the same reasonable amount of time as if I climbed on a public bus, for example. So just because you need the accessibility does not mean people then get to say, well, that's going to take longer. We'll worry about that later. And these are legal protections. Next up is it needs to be fair and equal fares. So true community sharing means zero pricing surcharges based on a passenger's disability or specialized equipment. You should not have to pay extra just because you require some sort of supportive device. The equivalent service area. The network must aim to serve the remote rural dirt roads with the same dedication as town centers. That plays out differently over the different types of services. For example, our buses, our public transit buses, they will vary from their route, but there are limits to what they can do. You will not be able to have a bus deviate from their regular route and go down a dirt road 10 miles off the route. That won't happen. But when we're trying to put together these other type of programs, specifically these volunteer type of programs, that's when you have an eye to say, wait a second, if we're saying this is our service area, then this needs to be our service area. And then finally, equally accessible booking. So you want to balance modern digital app tools with traditional telephone-based dispatch run by peer-to-peer volunteers. So many of you take advantage of technology. Some of you don't. We know with our older population, technology is often very overwhelming for them. We are still working in a world where we need to provide both. Now, in our industry, we often call this a one call or a one click system. The one call means there's a telephone number and someone on the other end who's going to answer your call. The one click means there's a website or some other app that you can go to and you can set up that ride and do what you need to do. Both of those systems are critically important where we're at right now in terms of people's comfort level. Not to mention in New Hampshire, if you're going to access the internet, you actually have to have internet signal. And we know that broadband is not equal everywhere. We know that wireless service is not equal everywhere we travel in the state. So I've mentioned a couple times the tech connection. Technology really is some of the magic spice that makes these things work a lot more effectively. You got to start somewhere though. Now, unless Lisa's been holding out on me, I am not aware that Able New Hampshire has $3-4 million just sitting around, just waiting for something to do. So in that case, we got to think, well, wait, if we wait for money, or how about this, if we wait for someone to give us permission, when's it ever going to happen? People need help today. So I don't want you to think about this fancy stuff that has evolved step by step and say, well, we're not there yet. We couldn't possibly. I want you to think about starting where you're at. So that means low tech. There are a lot of programs that are doing notebooks and calendars and phone calls out there. The goal, though, should be start where you're at, but move toward integrating with technology and into the system. Because when you do that, you actually will make it easier for all people to access your service. So I look at this as a long-term goal. So you want seamless integration into New Hampshire's official travel coordination directory. So in New Hampshire, we have Keep New Hampshire Moving. I've talked about this with this group as well. Now, right now, we're in version 1. It means it's a searchable database for you, but it is not a one-call or one-click system. Because once you find transportation options that might work for you, you have to pick up the phone or go to somebody's website, and then you can book your trip and check your eligibility. But if we're going to create these programs, what I'm saying to you is please, please do it with an eye of integrating with our statewide system. New Hampshire has a very strong go it alone attitude. I was born and raised in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I understand it. The granite flows through my blood as well. But the idea that we have to go it alone is actually a barrier to us innovating and delivering services that work for everybody. So we always want to keep an eye on its independent spirit, but find ways to integrate and work together into the system. So this is where I'm going to stop. But here's my message to you. Be the movement. So let's build a self-determined, accessible, peer-led transportation network in New Hampshire. That means new ideas. That means working with existing structures and organizations. Let's not reinvent the wheel when we don't have to, but definitely let's innovate when we could make that wheel even better. So with that, Lisa, I'll turn it back to you for questions or next part of discussion that you might want to do.
So raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question of Steve. While people think a little bit more, I'll just share that next month's Lunch and Learn is going to be on August 21st. We're going to talk about the Community Transportation Needs Assessment. We call it the CTNA. And that is the first of its kind needs assessment for transportation in the state of New Hampshire. And it's going to give us a glimpse of what is really happening in New Hampshire. These things that we always knew were there, but they weren't really or documented. We've got the data now. So we're going to talk about the needs assessment and what results showed us.
It looks like Kathy has her hand up.
So on these volunteer programs, like the one, I forget what they're called, but the one that you get like 150 miles, for instance. I thought that was really cool. Do you get to use your own vehicle? Like, cause I have a vehicle, but I don't always have a driver. Like, I lived all over this state, and there was a lot of volunteer programs up in like Lebanon, New Hampshire. Now, I live in Somersburg now, but like I couldn't access any of the volunteer programs because they didn't have vans, and I did, but they wouldn't let me use my van. I was just wondering, for any of these volunteer programs, can you use your own vehicle if you want to access the volunteer program?
That is possible depending on the system. And so that's the part that we have to create, because some systems right now would tell you what you heard, which is no. But we're talking about adapting those. And that may be creating something new, or it may be working with partners who are already doing it and sharing some ideas with them and figuring out how this could work. So Kathy, you've given us an example. You have a resource. You just need a driver to help with that resource. Think about how much good that vehicle could do for you and for other people. And it's a shame if we don't figure out how to use that, how to help you use it to help people. And that's, I think, what we're talking about. And that's why I wouldn't necessarily have suggested this to every group, but the ABLE group I've come to realize is you guys aren't going to sit around. You are trying to create your own solutions because you've recognized if you don't, it might not happen. So this is a group that I truly believe could start researching and looking into this and start figuring out, okay, how could we try this? Could we pilot something really small just to show people what might be possible? Because I've already told you that the laws permit those things. What we need to do is align the laws with the policies of those transportation companies so that these things are possible.
Right. And then, like, the other thing I wanted to do was be able to use my vehicle to help people in, like, an emergency response situation. Like, there's no registry around the state that this person has an accessible vehicle, and she can help. We can borrow her vehicle in the case of emergency to get this person to safety, because I mean, like I've been in like flash fires and all the things, and sometimes they need an accessible vehicle and they don't have one.
Yeah, emergency situations like that, there's big emergencies, but what bothers me when I think about these programs, and I know the limitations. I know how hard our transportation organizations work to do the best they can with the resources they have. But I'm blessed to own my own vehicle, and I'm physically able to drive it at this point in time. If I decide I want a hamburger from McDonald's, I can get up off of my chair and go get that hamburger right now.
Yeah.
People that do not have that luxury, we've got to do better. The thing is, I actually do believe that it's groups like ABLE. You have to do that advocacy piece, which is why I'm excited about the advocacy lunch and learn that's coming up in September, because you really do have to lead the charge here. And many of you already do. And I know ABLE New Hampshire does anyways.
I just want to touch back on what Kathy was saying earlier about having a vehicle and having it available for other people with a similar need. Kathy, I wish I had someone like you in my region because I receive a call every now and then from somebody who has gone to the hospital by way of an ambulance and they now need to get home, but there's no way for them to get home. If I knew somebody who had an accessible vehicle and we could just call up and say, hey, there's this really urgent situation. Can we rely on you to help us in this situation? You could
Yeah,
say
so
no,
you do
you
have
might
to
say
drive, so
yes.
I'd be fine with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of other people in the disabilities community feel that and they want to help others.
That's why we use the peer-to-peer term or the neighbor-to-neighbor. And I know I talked a lot about volunteer driver programs. There can be slight differences. So Kathy, today you don't need the permission of somebody else. You could make a personal choice and do exactly what Lisa was talking about right now. You could do that for yourself. So the question becomes, is an entity like ABLE or the support of our mobility managers, could they help create this more informal program where it is peer-to-peer, where it's like, hey, somebody called me, they need a specialized ride. I'm going to call up Kathy because she said she'd be willing if she's available. And so now I can pick up the phone and call you. That's exciting to me. And that's somewhat different. I don't see a lot of that happening in the state, even though it does get talked about. And I see our friend Andrew has his hand up, and Andrew is an example of somebody who is often at the table, advocating, thinking outside the box, researching, and asking the right questions. Why aren't we doing this? How could we do this? So sorry, Andrew, I cut you off.
No,
It's your
no,
turn.
it's fine. No, this all leads perfectly into the thing I was going to ask, which is I hear so many times about a great service or need. Somebody has that and they want to take that first step. We end up having a service in one little area that covers basically their backwoods. So what advice would you give to someone who wants to start that up, but in a way that they can integrate into the greater network so that we don't have them now completely cut off in their own little silo?
Yeah, Andrew, you and I talk a lot about this, and you know that I get a little bit crazy around this whole silo piece. And again, I told you I respect the go it alone Granite State spirit, but we simply got to do better. A fragmented system is one that does just what Andrew said. They cover their own little area. Now, that's not saying there's not value there. But what Andrew said is, how do we connect those? So let me give you an example of a church volunteer program. And I'm not sure whether she's still on, but I noticed that Jennifer Rabelais for the Alliance from Healthy Aging is here. And they have actually taken on a volunteer driver program network. So it's trying to network all the volunteer driver programs that exist, formal, informal, publicly supported, privately supported. And they are working on trying to bring the volunteer driver programs together to think about these things, to come out. And let me tell you why I think this is important. So imagine that you are St. Joe's volunteer driver program. It's church volunteers and it's to give rides to church members who need it. That's absolutely fine. If you were part of the network, here's the advantage. Someone calls up and you simply don't have the drivers that day. They're either booked or you're just low on drivers and you can't fill that ride. But you've developed a relationship and a connection to the statewide system of other volunteer driver programs. This means you could pick up the phone or you could go on the website and you could say, hey, I have somebody here that normally would use our program. We can't do that. Is there something you can do for them? It's a warm handoff. Doesn't that feel nicer than just hearing, I'm sorry, we can't help you today? So these are all the little ways. So how do you actually do this? So it's using those systems. That's why I keep beating the drums about our coordination systems, the regional coordination councils and the state coordinate council, because they will help. The mobility manager networks, they will help. They can be your voice, but they can connect the dots. So we are the mobility professionals. So you don't have to learn all those crazy terms I was throwing out today. I want you to just sort of think about what's possible. And then people like Lisa and myself and other mobility managers that are here and Jennifer Rabelais and the ABLE professionals, they can do some of the heavy lifting because we had to educate ourselves. Part of our job is learning about these things and figuring out how to use them. So we're a resource for you. But oftentimes we get stuck because we may have all these great ideas in our head, but until we have some people that are cheering us and going to help us and they're rolling up their sleeves, sometimes we can't get very far. But when we know we have a group of people behind us, we can do incredible things. So Andrew, I hope that does. So it's those coordination councils and it's using the mobility and other support professionals, but you all need to be inspired. Find out what might work, suggest those ideas, and find a way to get to yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right.
Just very briefly, thank you for putting this on. This was amazing.
Lots to think about for sure. So we'll wrap up for today, and you know how to reach me. You know how to reach Steve. Most of you do. And if you don't, then you certainly by now should know how to reach your mobility manager, and we can all connect you to one another. So thank you again for attending today. We'll drop off, and we appreciate your attendance, and we especially appreciate you, Steve. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great to see you all. I can't wait till the next time we can get together again.
This is sponsored by ABLE New Hampshire. If you want to become a member of ABLE and help us to bring to you other programs like this in the future, we would welcome that. Thank you very much for attending today.
Enjoy your summer.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.